So I just start talking and you start filming?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Jillian Gardner Andrews. I am conducting an oral history interview with Mel Adams on February 10th, 2017. The interview is being conducted on the campus of Washington State University, Tri-Cities. I will be talking with Mel about his experiences working on the Hanford site. And for the record, can you state and spell your name for us?
Melvin Adams, Melvin Adams.
Perfect. All right, Mel, can you tell me how and why you came to the area to work at the Hanford site?
Well, I started out after I graduated from college being a science teacher in high school, and did that for about 12 years, and found that I really couldn't make a very good living at that. So my family and I just went back to school to get a degree in environmental engineering, which was a newly developing field at the time. And because I really wanted to work in the environmental area. And as I was about to finish my program, saw an ad in the paper, Rockwell Hanford, which is one of the contractors at that time, wanting environmental engineers. So I applied and they called me up here for an interview. And so it wasn't long that we were moving up here. That was in 1979. So, can we just keep going? At that time, the site was still largely into plutonium production. So as far as I know, the group that I joined, under this crazy Irishman named Hank McGuire, was the first group that dealt with environmental issues. So I may have been one of the first environmental engineers actually hired at Hanford, because almost all the engineers were either chemical, and there were a few nuclear engineers, but that was the emphasis at that time. And then over the years, of course, the environmental work became more and more important, and finally they stopped making plutonium. So there was rapid growth in the environmental cleanup area. And at that time, I had enough experience under my belt to manage the environmental engineering group. And that was really interesting. So,
Where specifically on site did you spend the majority of your time?
well, I was all over the place. My office was out at 200 East area, which isn't far from Purex, if you know the site. There's an office building out there called 2750 East. All the buildings at Hanford have numbers and letters. Anyway, so I was out there for many years. A few years I was actually in town, and so I was kind of back and forth.
Okay. And could you describe a typical workday for yourself?
Well, when I was a junior engineer, it was mostly supporting the senior engineer and helping him write engineering studies and things of that sort. After I became a manager, it was quite different, of course, because I had 6 different managers and their groups to look over, plus a large budget with a lot of subcontractors. So at that time, I spent a lot of time on training and a lot of time on budgets, and didn't get to do much of the engineering work myself, but I had to oversee it, make sure it was properly staffed and the work was being done safely and so forth. So,
Could you explain what exactly an environmental engineer would do on site?
yeah, the field of environmental engineering is, when I took the courses, was largely involved with air pollution and treatment, and mostly water pollution, wastewater treatment. and there were some courses in solid waste management. So it was how to engineer things to keep the air clean, clean up water, dispose of solid waste, that kind of thing. There was a heavy emphasis also on monitoring in the field to detect environmental problems. So we had a lot of biology and chemistry. And then there was a large legal aspect because environmental law quickly became very complex. And particularly after the Nixon administration, when he created the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and so forth. And there was a large concern about cleaning up, you've probably heard the term RCRA sites. These are sites that were badly polluted, and they had to be cleaned up and the sites restored. So that got us into soils, understanding soils. And at Hanford, groundwater pollution was and still is a major issue. So there was an emphasis on also groundwater hydrology and how to clean up groundwater. So I'd say at Hanford, the part I worked in most was contaminated animals and plants, groundwater, solid waste, and contaminated soils.
So the animals that were contaminated and plants, these are the ones on site itself?
Yeah, that's less of a problem today because my group made some progress, and there's been a lot more progress since. But what would happen is we had sites where there was a lot of water, just billions of gallons of wastewater disposed to the soil, directly to the soil. And that went on for years when the plants like Purex were operating. So we had a lot of contaminated soils, and plants like the Russian thistle would go down 12 feet or so, and they were good at uptaking things like cesium and strontium, bringing them to the surface. And of course, then when they became tumbleweeds, they would blow towards the river. And the animals would, well, the plants would also be somewhat contaminated, and the animals would then become contaminated because they would eat herbivores like rabbits and so forth. And then they would spread out, and through their waste, they would spread contamination. So that was a real problem. It's been largely solved now. But we also had a lot of other problems with animals. Like we would get calls from people in offices with rattlesnakes under their desk and spiders and all kinds of things like that. One of the most humorous stories was my group were called the Bugs and Bunny Boys, or the Weeds. And they were a pretty interesting group. But they got a call from Patel one day and said, we got some lab mice that have gotten loose. And it's upsetting our experimental protocols, and we need to get these guys back in their cages. And so the Bugs and Bunny Boys were called on to solve that problem. So they said, well, we're going to need a lot of peanut butter and rolled oats. And so I gave them an emergency order so they could go to the store and buy lots of it. One day my manager came in, what are you trying to do, feed your family on the federal budget? So I had to explain to him that this was bait for the traps, live traps, so we could get these mice back under control. And he finally went away a little bit embarrassed. But those are some of the kind of jobs we got. Their workplace was really like a bizarre morgue. They had all these freezers full of animals that had been collected that were due to be analyzed for radioactivity. So there's lots of animals in this freezer, and there was plant specimens everywhere, plant presses and microscopes. And you go out in their garage, it looked like a farm shed. All these machinery to spray plants. And what they would do is each year go out and spray all the Russian thistles, and then come in and plow it up and replant with native bunch grass. So, because the bunch grass can't go down nearly as far to bring up radionuclides. So that's kind of that was one of the 6 groups I had, and I would say they were kind of the most interesting.
So would the environmental engineers themselves do the research on the animals?
Yes. And sometimes they would have to get help from Battelle or specialists, but they would collect and do most of the analysis themselves, and write reports and all that. The soil cleanup was a different matter. That involved a lot of soil sampling, and my group would actually go in and do some of the pilot scale cleanup where they go into the trenches and survey it, then bring in backhoes or whatever tools were needed to clean it up. So we contracted out a lot of the work, but not all of it. Another aspect was groundwater. Hanford has thousands of wells that are used to sample groundwater. There's still about 1,000 and some that are used even to this day to take samples probably once a month. And that way the groundwater hydrologists can tell where the plumes are moving and whether they're growing or shrinking. And then we would go in and use pump and treat, pump the water out, run it through a treatment plant, and put it back. And that worked. So the plumes at Hanford, for the most part, are shrinking, have been for quite a few years now. But there was over 100 square miles of polluted groundwater. So it was a major effort. But anyway, when we were drilling lots of wells, we had like 14 drill rigs in the field at a time with all the mobile labs and mobile equipment that was needed to go with them. And we had to use a certain kind of drilling rig, which we got from the Texas oil fields. So that was interesting because we had a lot of contractors we had to watch after, the drilling contractors. Another little known thing that most people don't understand is that Hanford is obsessed with safety. Not just radiological safety, but physical safety. So we had safety engineers and industrial hygienists working with us to make sure all the work was conducted safely. There was a lot of training, a lot of procedures, a lot of trial runs before you even went into the field. So that was an aspect of Hanford. People think it's just a nightmare, but it's not. It's highly controlled, highly proceduralized, and everyone has a lot of training. So it's done. The work was, I felt safer there than when I was a teacher. So.
So what would you say that the most challenging aspects of your work at Hanford were?
Well, it depended on the time when I was there. I mean, towards the end, the challenges were mostly managerial. But there were some interesting engineering challenges which I got to do and be involved in, or directly involved in some cases. One of them was that there was a requirement, a code of federal regulation, that said that if you're going to leave waste in place, and there will be some left at Hanford when it's all done, it's unavoidable, that you need to mark the sites so that if someone comes along 10,000 years from now, that you can communicate the danger to them. Well, so we had to develop some markers. Well, the problem is, are people still going to be speaking English that live here? Are we still going to have, technology like DVDs or at that time floppy disks or whatever? So how do you design a marker? Well, to do that, and that was a project I was working on my own because it was a small project money-wise. So I contracted an archaeologist who had been at all these sites like the Great Wall of China, the Acropolis, Stonehenge, and all of these places, which have been around a long time. So we started analyzing them and trying to get some clues as to how to make these markers. And I remember that one of the things you don't do is make them of metal. Because like on the Acropolis, there's holes where there used to be large metal shields. And the shields have been lost because people would scavenge them. So we didn't want to use metals. How large do you make the marker? Well, at Stonehenge, a lot of the stones less than twice human size were taken. So it's got to be at least twice human size. So we're talking about a pretty big marker. And then we had to figure out what languages to put the warnings on. We ended up with the 6 languages of the United Nations. Then the Yakima tribe came along and said, well, our language has been around a lot longer than yours. Use ours. Well, that's a good idea, except they didn't have a written language. They've been working on it, but we couldn't really use it because it wasn't written, at least at that time. So once we decided on the languages, then we had to decide on where to put it on the marker, how to incise the message so it doesn't get eroded. And we put on maps, we put on warning pictograms, like showing people digging and then collapsing and things like that, so people would get the idea you don't want to dig here. And these ended up being like an obelisk made of granite that were about, 16 feet high or so. And we never actually built one of those, but because they're not needed yet. But that basically the 200 East and West area would be surrounded by these markers such that if one was taken away, you could still reconstruct the perimeter. And then we decided to make some subsurface markers, small markers that could be put by the hundreds into a waste site, into a barrier. So if they started digging, they would get pull up these brightly colored with the radiation danger sign on them, magenta and yellow, with a symbol that showed what happens to you if you keep digging, a little cartoon. So we made hundreds of those, and those were made out of, we did a lot of testing with this Pottery Works, all kinds of testing to make sure that those would hold up in the ground. And of course, pottery has survived for thousands of years, from burial sites. So we knew that they would last a long time. But they had to be tested with ASTM tests and American Society of Testing, and to make sure that the colors would be retained and that the colors wouldn't fade, that they wouldn't break up in the soil due to temperature or water fluctuation, things like that. So that was really an interesting project. We made a lot of those, and there's actually a sample at the display case at Atomic Brew. If you look, when you go in Atomic Brew, they've got a lot of memorabilia from Hanford, and somehow they got a hold of a sample subsurface marker. They're about this big, and so that's kind of interesting.
Are any of the subsurface markers in place already?
Yeah, there was a lab. I don't remember the number of it, the building number, that was entombed some years ago, and there were hundreds of those markers that were put into that entombment. So.
And were the markers themselves made on site?
No, actually we had to put those out to bid, and they were ceramic, of course. And there was a potter back in Vermont that won the bid, and they made them. And then we sent them out to testing. And so that was kind of a little interesting project, making markers, both the large and the small ones.
Do you know if they'll still be using the small ones in the future?
I hope so. It's a good idea. Of course, they aren't to the point yet where they're going to start building large disposal barriers. And we planned to put those in when the barriers were built. So I wouldn't be surprised if they end up ordering thousands of those and they end up going into these barriers, because it's still a requirement. Like, there's a very large landfill out at Hanford that my teams did the first work on, and there's been thousands of truckloads, and they've got these huge trucks of soils and solid waste that have been dug up and put into that landfill. Well, someday that's going to have a barrier put over it to keep the water plants and animals out. And that was another fascinating project, to develop that barrier. So probably they will distribute some of the subsurface markers in that barrier.
Can you describe the project of building or creating the barriers for the landfills?
Yeah, that was a development project undertaken by my group and with quite a bit of support from Battelle. And the idea was that we wanted a barrier that would be made primarily of natural materials and that would function according to natural ecological processes and would last hundreds, if not thousands of years without a lot of maintenance or any maintenance. So for that, we got this idea of using what's called the outflow law, which says if you've got a fine soil over coarser materials, that soil has to be completely saturated before it'll break through. So we felt that since we only have 6 inches of rain a year, not this year, that we could make a fine layered barrier over a graded coarse layered barrier. and then plant that with native bunch grass, which would, as the water accumulated, evapotranspirate the water out before it could break through. And then we also had like a gravel mulch, which has been used since ancient times to help store the water in the soil layer and also to prevent wind erosion. So that had to be carefully designed. And then, so we had the design, then it became we used archaeological analogs, or actually geologic analogs. As you know, this area was hit by huge floods of biblical proportions at the end of the last ice age. So, and when the icebergs grounded at Hanford, it's now Hanford, they melted and left these mounds called berg mounds. And these mounds had been there for 10,000 years. And some of them were layered almost like our barrier. So we studied the bejeebers out of those because they gave us clues of what could last. And then we had out there also caliche layers, where the water would go down to the soil and then precipitate these calcium carbonate chemicals, and the water couldn't get through that caliche layer. So we wanted to know, how does that work? And finally we got a design for this barrier, but then it had to be tested. So we tested it in wind tunnels, lysimeters, which were like big cylinders, highly instrumented with the layers in there. And we stressed those with water, twice as much as we usually get, and wind. And we even put live animals on there to see if the badgers would harm it. Actually, they helped the barrier performance. So there was a lot of field data collecting and research that had to be done. Then finally, this was about the time I retired, they built a full-scale barrier over one of the cribs. And a crib was a water waste disposal. And some of these are highly contaminated soils. So they built one over this crib. And they've been monitoring it now, Battelle has, for 10 years or so. Actually, more like 15. And keeping all kinds of data. And it seems to be working because the water, plants, and animals are not getting through it. So that's called the Hanford Barrier. And that'll probably be used in some form or another for this large landfill and other sites that are left behind.
So how do they go about monitoring it to see if the water, plants, and animals are affecting it?
Well, they have instruments they can put down that keeps track of the soil water. They can go in and excavate some of the plants, see how deep they've gone. They can actually do a water balance. They can figure out the evaporation and how much rainfall has been on the snowfall on the barrier. So there's quite a bit of instrumentation that they can use to do that.
Do you think that the snowfall we've had this year will have an effect on that?
No, not unless it amounts to more than 12 inches of water. And I doubt if it reaches that much. So they did irrigate the barrier, parts of it, to twice the annual rainfall. It didn't break through. They also set fires on the barrier, because we have range fires. The bunch grass that they used is actually, the native bunch grass is very fire resistant. I mean, it'll burn, but it doesn't destroy the roots. And so it comes back right away. So it's pretty well thought out. And so far, the data looks pretty promising that these barriers will work. And the natural analogs told us that as well. And then, of course, they also developed mathematical models so they could simulate, if we put on 4 times water, what do we predict? And those simulations look pretty good. But you can't rely just on simulations. You have to actually test it.
Was there testing done for if an earthquake happened?
Not specifically, but actually Hanford's in a fairly low earthquake risk area. But we were concerned with the barrier about collapses, particularly if there was a void underneath that could collapse during an earthquake. So we actually developed a big pile driver with ports welded on it, such that we could, it was like a big I-beam, we could vibrate that in. At the same time, we could inject grout, which is like a cement, to fill up those voids. As we pulled the hammer out, would collapse the voids and seal it up with concrete. So we're pretty confident that earthquakes aren't going to really destroy that barrier. It's like a really sturdy foundation for a house, really, or anything else. My group did, though, manage the seismograph stations that are around Hanford, and they could tell us every day whether there's an earthquake or not. So it was a really diverse group that we had. We even had historians, because we found that to analyze these sites to get data was very expensive. You had to either go out there with drilling equipment and portable labs and all that, but it would be much cheaper if we could figure out from the records that were left behind what we were up against. But the records at Hanford were very scattered, loosely organized. A lot of them almost got thrown in the dumpster. So we hired because there were so many letters. Turned out that letters were the major way of communicating in those days. And we hired historians and librarians to go out and rescue these, catalog them, study them, so that our engineers would know what to expect in any given place. And that saved us millions of dollars.
And where would these historians find the letters?
Well, that was part of the job, was to figure out where all the files were and go to those places and try to round them up, put them in our big library, and before they got, destroyed for whatever reason. There were libraries around Hanford that were scattered. A lot of it was in engineers' files, so we had to, plead with the engineers to let us into those so we could pull out things we needed. And so it was a big job. Records management at Hanford was, probably still is, a big job.
And do you know where those letters ended up?
Well, when I left, they were in a library in 2750 East. And we had a librarian. I don't know if they still have a librarian. There was a lot of photos that were taken inside of tanks, which could be very valuable. And towards the end of my career out there, we started getting data overload. There was so much data being collected from the tanks of just about every isotope on the periodic table that it was very hard to keep track of all this data. And the engineers wanted to know, okay, if we make a transfer from one tank to another, how does that change the chemical composition of both tanks? Sometimes it would take these engineers and scientists months to figure that out. So we went to Battelle with some money, a lot of money, and we said, build us an electronic database to have all this data cataloged and accessible. And they did a good job. But then we said, okay, now design us a way to do an automatic report when there's a tank transfer. And they did that. So eventually the scientists could order a report from Battelle. A few hours later, get back a report that used to take them months to do. Major breakthrough. And I think that's still in operation.
And would that be more of a here's what would happen report, or is it a this already happened and now
Well,
what chemicals are going?
It was at that time we were more interested in what happens when you make a transfer. But the tank data can be, of course, used, like with the vitrification plant, to project what's there and figure out what it's going to look like as it comes into their tanks. And so it's both. At that time, the major emphasis was on tank transfers.
And was there major concerns for how certain chemicals would react with each other in for lack of a better term, bad ways?
Yeah, like drugs which you take and yes, that was a concern. And that's one of the things they looked at. If we do this transfer, what's the waste going to look like? Are we going to have more concentrations of one thing that might adversely react with something else? Another thing was criticality. You know, if you get too much plutonium together at the right place, at the right time, in the right configuration, you know, you get a nuclear reaction. It's not like a mushroom cloud, but it's the same concept. And we didn't want criticalities, bad news. So they could use this to determine, hopefully, if there's any critical elements building up during these transfers.
And so to avoid that, it would just be don't mix this tank with this tank?
Or don't move as much. Or if you do, mix it with something else so it doesn't get concentrated. I mean, there's a lot of ways to prevent criticality. Like one of my chapters in the book that I wrote is about one of the cribs, which I didn't work on, but it's so fascinating. There had been so much plutonium put in that crib that they were actually, and a crib is basically a drainage field in the soil, that they thought it might go critical. It's hard to think of enough plutonium being in the soil to create a, you know. But so they went in and started removing some. To do that, they had to use a robot, and they used a mechanical arm to dig some of it out. And they ended up digging, I forget the exact figure, pounds of plutonium from that crib. So it wouldn't go critical. So yeah, that was one of the concerns. Criticality. One of my favorite sites at Hanford was called U Pond. When I got to Hanford, one of the first environmental engineers, we had 4 ponds where there was billions of gallons of water going to these ponds for waste for disposal. And it would drain into the ground. And He said, I want you to look at the laws that you studied in environmental school and tell me if we have any regulations coming up that are going to impact these farm or these ponds. So I remember my first document out there was Pond Management and the Law. And being fresh out of an environmental law class, I said, oh man, you're in for trouble. There's RCRA, there's CERCLA, there's TSCA, there's a lot of other minor laws, and they're going to have a major impact. Well, the document went out to review, mostly at that time, chemical engineers. And they said, oh, this is nonsense. We only have to worry about the Atomic Energy Act. So the report got put in my desk and was basically shelved. About maybe 2 years later, the Department of Energy signed an agreement with the Department of Ecology, State of Washington, and the EPA, saying you must follow RCRA, CERCLA, and comply with them. That was a huge impact, still is to this day. And so I pulled the document out. One of the things I learned at Hanford, if you write a document that is not well received, just put it away for 6 months and then you'll need it. So now, and that led to a lot of job opportunities because later on my group got involved in cataloging all the sites. Are they RCRA, CERCLA, who's in charge of them, which regulations apply, and all of that was a big job.
And what do those acronyms stand for?
See if I can remember. RCRA is Resource Environmental and Conservation Act, Recovery Act. And CERCLA was the Comprehensive Environmental Reclamation Act. Close. It's been a while since I worked on those. So RCRA and CERCLA were big deals. Anyway, so environmental regulations take a lot of time to comply with at Hanford. And that's, some people say, well, that's just bureaucracy. Well, yes and no. The RCRA and CERCLA really helped us group the waste sites and manage them in such a way that was efficient. And so it wasn't all bad. It wasn't all just paperwork. In fact, there was a lot of analysis that went in. What's the best way to go about cleaning this up? And it forced you to look at options.
What would you say are or were the most rewarding aspects of your work?
Well, for many years, the most rewarding aspect is that we would write papers and get them published in journals and go to conferences and make presentations. It was a lot of original work because we were doing things that had never been done before. And towards the end of my career out there, that went away. Not necessarily because it was all done, but the emphasis changed to let's just go in there and get the job done. And so there was less opportunity to be creative, to solve problems, to present that to your peers. So that was a real loss. But that was certainly one of the most rewarding aspects of it, was to be able to do that.
Right. What are some of your memories of major events on the site or in the Tri-Cities, such as the plant shutting down or any local political or social things that you can remember from your time in the Tri-Cities?
Well, I'd say one of the biggest changes while I was there was the transition from plutonium production to cleanup. A lot of things changed. Like security was not as strict. Didn't need a Q clearance any longer, which means that the federal officers wouldn't come in and interview your neighbors every year. Does he drink? Does he pay his bills? All that kind of stuff. So that kind of went away. Our lunch boxes were not searched as thoroughly at coming in or going out. There isn't any plutonium really left at Hanford except in some of the waste sites dispersed in the soil. But so that's really a big change. A lot of the buildings have been torn down that were problematic. Like one of my first assignments was we had this laundry that washed contaminated clothes called whites. And every once in a while there would be contaminated lint blowing around on the street. So we were sent over there, and I was just a junior engineer at that time with one of the senior guys to figure out what was going wrong. And we traced it to a piece of equipment in the laundry called the hydroclone, I think it was. And it was clogged up, and it was the lint, the wet lint was getting into some of the ducts and so forth, drying out, and then ending up blowing out onto the street, which is kind of disconcerting. So we got the rotoclone cleaned out and back in service. Well, that laundry no longer exists. There's a modern laundry that they built, I think in town here somewhere, that does the laundry now. It's all automated and everything. But that was the most bizarre place I've ever seen. Because you go in the laundry, there was a line painted on the floor. And one side was clean laundry, the other side was contaminated laundry. There was no barrier or anything. It's the line painted. And the procedures on each side were completely different. Like the people over there were wearing whites, had certain protocols. And on the clean side, you didn't need to wear whites, that kind of thing. Just really strange. So a lot of those facilities no longer exist, just as well. But that was a big change. So the cultural change from rigorous secrecy to less secrecy was a big change.
And when did you start noticing that happening?
Well, the plutonium, Purex shut down, I think it was in 1980. I have to look in my book to see. 1988 or something like that. And so after that's when it really started to change. Now, right now, they're tearing down the PFP, the plutonium finishing facility. And so that means that the plutonium's all shipped out a long time ago. Mm-hmm. And so it's just a big change. Like, to get in that place, you had to be escorted, even though you had a Q clearance, Yeah, so that was one of the major ones. Another change is, like I said before, when I first went to work there, it was a culture dominated by chemical engineers. And that changed drastically because now we needed a very diverse bunch, including geologists, groundwater hydrologists, biologists, historians, environmental chemists, the whole geophys. We needed a whole bunch of different specialties, and that was a big change, particularly from a management point of view, because now you had to manage all kinds of different engineers with different outlooks on life, and that could be interesting at times.
Going back to talking about security, before Purex shut down and you noticed a drop in the secrecy and everything, how did the intense security and secrecy on site affect your job?
Well, like in my book, they asked me, don't you have some pictures from your time working out there? I said, no, I was never allowed to take a camera in. To take a camera in, even after Purex shut down, we had to get a special permit. Well, so the secrecy was, you had to be careful what you took in your lunchbox. You didn't want to lose your pass card, your ID card, because that could cause you some problems. You were restricted from going into certain areas. All your documents had to be screened to see if there's anything classified in them. Like I said, your security review wasn't as rigorous. You didn't have your coworkers, your neighbors, saying, well, he's smoking grass or whatever. And they asked questions that would be unheard of today, like, is he homosexual? You couldn't do that today, shouldn't do that. But those were legitimate questions back in those days, I guess, because of the threat of blackmail. They were really worried about, they knew that there were foreign agents working to get access to information. And so I guess anything that could cause you to be blackmailed, like being in debt or drinking heavily, would be of concern. That all loosened up and changed quite drastically. Let's see what else. Well, I guess those were kind of the main things. It was like my wife never saw where I worked, never. So there was still some walls between you and your family. I remember sometimes I'd go out and work overtime and walk out of the hall, and all of a sudden there'd be a guy with a rifle, or a woman with a rifle, body armor, the whole 9 yards, pointing a gun at you. What are you doing here? And I'd have to pull out my ID real quick. So there was constant patrols all over the place.
Why would it matter what's in your lunchbox?
Well, they didn't want you bringing anything in that might blow up or contain a tape recorder or a camera or anything that could be used to gather information. Same way going out, they didn't want you going out with a tape recorder or a classified document or whatever, So it was very, very rigorous.
And when you mentioned that your wife never went to where you worked, did you find it difficult to talk about what you were doing? Were you concerned about talking to your wife or family members about the work you did on site?
Not so much, but in the early days of Hanford, that was really something. I mean, until the bomb was dropped, there's probably only half a dozen people that knew what 50,000 people were building out here, And it was very rigorous security. I didn't hesitate to talk much about what I did, except there were certain projects where I had to use classified documents, and I couldn't talk about those. But she was restricted from coming out to the site. Now, I understand that's changed somewhat. It's easier to get a pass to go out and go to your son and daughter workday kind of thing. But yeah, it was, and it didn't bother me. I mean, that was just part of the job.
What would you like future generations to know about working at Hanford or living in the Tri-Cities during the Cold War?
Well, during the Cold War, it probably wasn't any more tense living here than it would be anywhere else. I mean, most of the neighbors didn't build fallout shelters or that I know of. When I was a kid, of course, we had, drills where we had to crawl under our desks and kind of thing. So I did notice that the Tri-Cities had and still does to some extent a very unique culture. It's not so much a culture of secrecy anymore, but you can still see the influence of the early days of Hanford if you look for them. Particularly some of the old timers are, of course they probably consider me to be an old timer now, but are not as willing to talk about it as some of the younger folks. But there was a time when, before Richland became a city, that if your light bulb went out, you just called up the GSA and they'd come and change it. That doesn't happen anymore. Once Richland became a city, everything changed as far as you could buy a house, including a government house. Like I go to one of the first 4 churches that was actually established by the government in the beginning. Now there's all kinds of churches, but at the beginning there was only 4 churches. And they were sponsored by the government, so kind of interesting. You don't find many places where that is the case. Also, many of the street names in Richland were named after officers that graduated from West Point that worked in the Corps of Engineers, and those are the street names. For instance, I live on Goethals Street. Goethals was a West Point graduate, worked for the Army Corps of Engineers, and he is the one that finished building the Panama Canal. Who would have thought? So even the streets were named after, certain class of people, certain people. So that's part of the culture.
Did you find it to be shocking, I guess, going from being a high school teacher to an environmental engineer?
Being an environmental engineer was a lot easier job, and it paid better, and a lot easier job. I found some of the things I learned teaching high school helped me a lot on how to manage people and motivate people. Really helped me a lot. So I didn't, other than being glad to be out of the classroom for a while, now I've kind of gone back to it. I teach science in my basement to kids.
Oh, really?
But, well, my wife teaches piano, and some of them want to do science also, so they just come downstairs. Anyway, no, I didn't notice a big difference as far as, except it was a lot easier work. I do remember they sent me to a week at UCLA Management School one time, and this was many years ago. There was a executive from Silicon Valley there, and he said, you need 4 kinds of people in any successful organization: artists, judges, warriors, and explorers. Well, almost everyone at Hanford was either a judge or a warrior. There weren't any artists, there weren't any explorers. Well, I actually took that advice to heart, and when I started hiring for the environment engineer group, we brought in, now it doesn't mean they have a degree in art, but people with more of an artistic temperament that could present things attractively, and people willing to explore new ideas. And that helped a lot. Being a teacher, you were surrounded by people of diverse fields, whether you wanted to be or not. Like, we had an ongoing battle with the English department. Like, I'd send a student over there, this to the reading specialist, and they would say, I'd say, he can't read. And they'd come back after doing some tests. Yeah, you're right, he can't read. Well, what are you going to do about it? I don't have time to teach him to read. That kind of thing was very irritating. And I found that some teachers were really slackers, and they wanted to be carried by the union, and they were to some degree. And I didn't like that. So I was kind of glad to leave teaching. But I did bring a lot of those skills with me.
Can you tell me about your books, but specifically your most recent one?
Okay, well, WSU has published 3 of my books, WSU Press. One was about the time I retired, which has been like 14 years now. It was about growing up in the desert of Oregon, eastern Oregon. It's called Netting the Sun. And it was kind of a memoir, but like my latest book, it kind of wove the cultural and physical geography and history through the memoir. Then about a year ago, they published another book about Eastern Oregon, which was more of a guidebook with maps and photos, and called Remote Wonders. And it has a pull-out map and a lot of photos. It's designed to take you on a trip around the Eastern Oregon outback, and see a lot of the interesting places that I knew growing up as a kid that I've gone back to many times. My most recent book came out about 3 months ago. It's called Atomic Geography, and it's a personal history of Hanford. And it kind of weaves some of the stories of Hanford and some of the cultural history of Hanford through my personal experiences. It's not a real long book. It's definitely written for the general reader. And it's gotten really good reviews. It was named one of the top 10 books from university presses this year. And that's good, because university presses publish a lot of books. So I don't know how well it's selling, but I think it's selling okay. They only pay me once a year, so. Anyway, WSU Press has been really fun to work with, but it takes about 2 or 3 years to get through the process of writing a book, they have to go through all of their committees. Then there's all kinds of editorial steps. It's a long process. But that Hanford book is intended for the general reader. You can get a flavor of how the culture has changed going clear back to the fishing by the tribes. You can get a feel of what's out there as plants, animals, geology. Some of the engineering challenges I go through in the book. And some of the supreme ironies of Hanford. Let me think here. Probably the major irony of Hanford is that it's basically a huge wildlife refuge. It's not a wasteland like a lot of people think. It's 580 square miles, but only about 100 square miles of it, and most of that's groundwater contamination, was ever used for any kind of activity that created waste. So, and part of it is now a national monument and a national park. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's really irony.
Okay, Mel, is there anything that we haven't discussed yet that you want to talk about?
I don't think so. I'm kind of running out of steam. I just summarize by saying it's a really strange, bizarre, and interesting place.
Mm-hmm. That it is. I agree. All right. Well,
Okay.
Thank you so much, Mel.
Thank you.